Hello, let's begin by acknowledging the theme of NAIDOC Week, which is this week. Always was, always will be. And the First Nations people of each of the lands in which we meet across Australia and overseas. For me, here in Sydney, Australia, I pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their elders past, present and emerging. This event is co-hosted by the Australian Society for Computers and the Law and the Association for Corporate Counsel Australia. A special thank you to Kelly, Irina and Ingrid from ACC for all your hard work behind the scenes. On the topic of future boards in the digital and disrupted world, we are joined by a panel of distinguished leaders, and I'm very excited to give you a list of their names. You can see them also on the screen here. We have Heather Campbell, current CEO of Bush Heritage Australia, Robert Hillard, the Chief Transformation Officer at Deloitte Asia Pacific and Chairman of the Australian Information Industry Association, Professor Matt Kuperholz, the Chief Data Scientist for PwC, and Sally Ann Williams, the CEO of Cicada Innovations, a leading Australian deep tech incubator. We've asked each of our speakers to give their particular take on the topic of future boards. So expect to hear a range of ideas and views, and maybe even some disagreement along the way on a broad range of topics, including data and decision-making, sustainability, representation, AI. Also, time permitting, we hope to answer as many of your comments and queries. Please post these in Q&A and we'll answer them as we go along. Now for a quick introduction to our wonderful moderator, Olga Ganopolsky. Olga is General Counsel for Privacy and Data at Macquarie Group. She's a recognised expert on data protection and privacy, from strategy and compliance to even law reform across multiple industries, including the finance and banking industry. In addition to her leadership in the private sector, Olga has played a critical role in other industry and professional associations, including the International Association for Privacy Professionals, Association for Corporate Counsel, and is currently chairperson of the Law Council of Australia's Business Law Privacy Subcommittee. Join me in welcoming Olga and our distinguished panel. Olga, thank you for moderating this session, and now over to you.
Thank you very much, Marina. I think the order of proceedings today is firstly for me to apologise that I'm not enhancing all of my privacy rights by being incognito here. This is a genuine computer malfunction on my end, so apologies, but might be solved in the course of the discussion. But without wanting to digress, we actually have a very distinguished panel today, and they have a lot of things in common, but also a lot of important differences. I will get each person to introduce themselves and provide a bit of a window as to why they're so passionate about future board and AI. But I can already detect a theme of both agreement and disagreement, given the fact that what you will hear today will touch partly on what a board and governance looks and feels like, but also invite you to think about what does big data, AI, and the hard sciences have to do with composition of boards, the kind of debates that boards have, and the sort of leadership boards have to show, both in complex areas like AI, but also in the day-to-day governance of corporations. And we're very, very fortunate here to have a variety of senior executives who both lead boards, lead organizations, and will have what I'm sure will be a very lively debate. So can I get Sally Ann to introduce herself first?
Thanks, Olga. So my name's Sally Ann Williams. I'm the CEO of Cicada Innovations, Australia's oldest and largest deep tech incubator. We are on Gadigal land, and so I would like to just take a moment to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, which is Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. One of the things that we do at Cicada Innovations is incubate science and engineering businesses solving the world's most pressing problems. So we work with a range of companies, starting from everything from single founders and sole founders all the way through to companies that are now scaling overseas and employing up to about 80 to 100 people. They work in medtech, ag tech, food tech, energy, sustainability, artificial intelligence, software and hardware solutions that are being deployed on infrastructure projects, software and hardware being deployed around food provenance and modern slavery, you name it. If you can find a UN SDG, you can find a company in here that's probably working on something to solve that. And these companies are really future focused, they are forward focused, they are in some cases using science and engineering to bring products and services to market in places that are not yet regulated. So they're at the forefront of helping to shape some of the policy and how we need to think about that. It's a really great place to be. It's a really interesting place to be. And I think the conversation that we're going to have today around future boards, for me, it's the exciting part is what do we need now on boards today in Australia? And, you know, the provocative question that I'd want to throw out there is, do we actually have what we need around the boardroom table? And my answer is no. From a technology perspective and a deep understanding of some of these, challenges that we're facing, we probably don't know. I don't right now, but also how do we transition and build the boards of the future? Because as we're building companies and we're bringing these problems and solutions to the world, we really need to think about how do we have the right governance structure? How do we have the right leadership? How do we have the right support mechanisms? And what does that look like? And it differs greatly from an early stage company to somebody that is, listed. So how do you transition boards and board growth and development over time? So I'm going to just leave it there because I actually want to get into the conversation with the panelists. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that we can talk about and some really pressing problems that we can discuss as well.
Thank you, Sally-Anne. Robert, can we ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely, thank you. And Sally-Anne, I'll follow the theme and just also acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I, again, am very, very pleased with the theme of NAIDOC week this week. And so my background, I'm the Chief Transformation Officer for Deloitte Asia Pacific. I've spent until recently, last just over 2 years as a member of Deloitte's Global Board of Directors, Chairman of the Australian Information Industry Association. I've been involved with boards in different ways for a long time and worked with the AIIA on various aspects of board skills for the future. If I just build on Sally-Anne's comment, I think one of the things I'm really interested in discussing this evening is the changing role of the board and how those changes have been accelerated post-COVID. And if I can just particularly leave this idea, a lot of the discussions that we have with boards is about responsibility for risk and whether there is such a thing as a low risk or no risk path, and then whether or not we have the skills around the table to be able to properly articulate a risk appetite and frame it in a way that makes sense and allows management to be able to define strategy in the context of that risk appetite. Really easy to say, gets increasingly hard to do in the world that we're facing. Olga, I think you're going to pass on that.
No, we're back on. Can I ask Matt to introduce himself? And Matt very kindly agreed to do a walking tour as he takes us through the issue. So it's wonderful that the audience today can actually see you. Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much, Olga. Hi, I'm Matt. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at PwC. And when I gave up being an actuary in the late 90s, I was fortunate enough to join an AI startup and have been facing into solving clients' problems with AI for over 20 years now. And it's interesting that this was once an incredibly novel idea. In fact, the idea in general that business problems could be solved through data and analytics. And nowadays, of course, we take that as a foundational fact. And moreover, the times we're living in where the increase in data and computing power and the power of AI and the power of automation and the power of technologies of trust like distributed ledgers are all in fact exponential. It's rapidly changing the possibilities for organizations as to what they can achieve. No longer are we sort of limited by a zero-sum game, but rather we've got this incredible asset in data that we can create value from without using it up. So there's more value to be shared, effectively happier customers and a more profitable company. But what's been particularly interesting to me as I've seen this technology become democratized and much easier to access is that we're actually have to pay attention to the other side of the coin, which is what's the new risk profile exposed by these technologies. I've spent the last couple of years focused on something I call responsible AI, and that relates to the governance, the ethical frameworks, and the continual monitoring of the performance of the AI, its fairness, detecting bias, ensuring it's explainable and transparent where needed, and also robust and secure. So I'm fantastically excited about all the possibilities of these technologies and what it affords companies and citizens and consumers today. But I'm also seeing that the biggest mega trend really is actually the increased focus on governance. As it gets more complex and more sophisticated, regulators, citizens, and customers are going to want to know, how are you using my data? How did you come to that decision? Was it fair? Do you have the proper governance in place? And can you explain to me, not necessarily tomorrow, but in a year's time, how you made a decision which affects me? And I think that there's incredible benefit, but we're possibly a little bit behind on ensuring that we're also appropriately governing and having the right ethical and frameworks in place for the use of these technologies.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And last but not least, we have Heather, who will introduce herself in a second. Heather, over to you.
Thank you, Olga. So I'm Heather Campbell, the CEO of Bush Heritage Australia. And you may think it's a bit unusual that I'm joining you. So I'm coming from Wurundjeri country on the edge of the Yarra Valley. And we're an organisation that manages landscapes. We fundamentally believe in that preciousness of all of the life within Australia, everything from the smallest ant to the tallest tree. So we work across 11 million hectares of land, so half the land the size of Victoria, working with traditional owners, farmers, and others to actually support the preciousness of those landscapes. So our day-to-day is fire, ferals, and weeds. But data is becoming even more important with how we manage that. How do we deal with understanding how feral cats operate and how we can actually beat them at their sneaky game of trying to consume everything? How do we actually look at how we use data, particularly for our supporters? We have 35,000 donors effectively, and we only exist because of the trust they have in what we do and of how we treat them and how we treat their privacy. So it's a really big issue for us then as to how we look at data into the future and how we maintain that privacy, how we continue to maintain that trust. So I've spent a lot of time sitting on not-for-profit and government boards, and actually getting the right mix of board members into the future is going to be really important as we face huge challenges, whether that be climate change and the frequency of storms and things like the Black Summer, whether that be a mistrust in institutions that we see because of how social media and some louder voices or bots, etc., have actually distorted some of the messages. So I think it's going to be really important that we have that diversity of skills on a board. And I think the other thing, particularly to reflect on during NAIDOC week, is how we might think of data and how traditional owners might think of it very, very differently. And our responsibility as organisations to make sure that we protect their knowledge, that we store it in a way that is acceptable to them, and that recognises that. And that's a really important thing, and something that I think most of us are just on the start of that journey. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, Olga.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very healthy introduction to what I said could actually lend itself to a little bit of a debate. So if I can just promote health discussion to sort of take the lead from Heather and the very important call out for diversity, especially as we celebrate NAIDOC week, as you say. How does this panel approach the challenge of, on the one hand, looking for diversity, but on the other hand, using technology that's by its nature looking to standardize, find patterns, and blend those emerging patterns into the decisions that ultimately humans make, whether they make them individually as senior executives of organizations or collectively as boards. What's your view, Robert? Let's start with you.
So I think that it's really interesting. We are accelerating the amount of data that's available to companies, and Matt touched on before that data is powering AI, and boards are trying to govern in that context. So the first thing is that the more diversity we have around the board table, the more likely we are to be able to consider consider what we haven't thought about. What are the permutations that might cause an issue for stakeholder groups, be it because of demographics, because of gender, because of social issues, geography. The more diversity we have around the table, that is actually the role of the board, to be able to stress test, not to consider every permutation, but to provide a stress test for management in whether or not they really have thought about those things that could be coming. The other thing, and I touched on risk. One of the problems that when we face a future world that has always been uncertain, but after 2020 feels even more uncertain. We can't correctly write down what the risks are going to be, what the issues are going to be that we're going to face in the next 10 years. But we should be getting ourselves into the habit of saying that the unexpected will happen. We've got to expect the unexpected, and we sort of know that that it will be something that completely left field. But we can anticipate a number of those sorts of curveballs to occur during a period of time. And we're going to need some skills to deal with some technological disruption. We're going to see some societal disruption, and we're going to see some environmental disruption. And if there's one thing that we know has changed in 2020 that should change the way we look at the diversity of our boards, it's the social expectations of organisations have distinctly changed. 2019 and before was really geared around the idea of a loss of trust in large organisations and institutions. 2020 has seen a re-emergence of trust, but the emergence of expectations. We are looking for, society is looking for sustainable governance, sustainable environment, sustainable economy. And in order to do that, is willing to make some trade-offs. And again, there's all sorts of surveys saying they're willing to take those trade-offs. Boards have to be the ones that will guide their organisations through that change. And again, diversity is essential for it.
Heather, how does that play out in a diverse organisation such as yours, given the comments that you made in your opening remarks about both diversity of thought and kind of the cultural diversity that we wish to support?
Yeah, well, I think what is really important for us, and because we're working across traditional lands, Australia is all traditional lands, that for us it's really important that we have Aboriginal people on our board, so that we make sure that we have that diversity there, but we have the diversity of experience and thinking, and age and backgrounds, from lawyers, from researchers. Through to people with professional banking skills, other sort of skills. I think the key thing though is just not doing the standard skills matrix of going, here's the list, tick that box. Is actually understanding more about the individuals and the diversity of thinking, and having people that will really probe and question. And I think of our president, Sue O'Connor, who is an amazing leader, sits on a lot of government and corporate boards, but is also a photographic artist. And her ability then to also see in the landscape and ask us questions about that landscape that we wouldn't have thought at, because she's got that different lens. Now, you're not going to have that sitting on a skills matrix, but it's really getting to know those other passions of people, and having that eclectic group that can bring all their skills to bear is really, really important.
Thank you. Speaking of passions, that's a sort of a wonderful segue to innovation and the focus of Sally's opening remarks about startups and what it takes to run an organization where we assume that diversity is much easier to come by as a new organization, as organizations that are started on the whole concept of novelty. Is that an assumption that we need to also throw out the window? Like, many others when we search for that?
Yeah, look, it's such a great question. Sadly, yes. Let's throw it out the window, because what you find with most founders is they pick somebody they work with well, and they pick their best mate. Who can I spend 18 hours a day with? I've heard the most ridiculous line, which I absolutely hate, is who can I pass the airport test with? So if I'm stranded in an airport, who can I get along with and want to work that hardly with? And I'm like, well, you'd never employ me, because I'm a nightmare to be stranded at the airport with. My husband doesn't want to even be with me, right? Like, I know that I don't want to be with me. I'm horrible in that environment. So I think we actually have to, there's a couple of things with diversity, and I think it rings true from startups all the way through. There's three things that we need to start with and we need to all kind of get on board with. And one is the fact that every single one of us is biased. We are all biased. It is the way our brain is designed to work. Our brain is wonderfully complex and extraordinarily simple in some things. And it's designed to work like a computer and binary. And it's a fight and flight mechanism. It's a how do I take all this disparate information that is coming at me and bombarding me every single second, how much can I actually process at any given time? And actually, you know, the delta between those two things mean that 99.9999% of the time, every decision you make is based on your pre-existing history and understanding of the world and the culture that we live in. So we're all operating from a biased perspective. That doesn't mean we're evil. It just means that we're making decisions based on our experience of the world. So we have to start with that understanding. The second thing is the minute you have that understanding, we have to go, well, okay, what does that mean for me and my organization? And I will say that the Australian startup ecosystem has been very receptive to this. And I will give credit to the venture capital community, because once I started talking about this when I was at Google for many, many years on the engineering team, and I was talking about it publicly and getting on my little soapbox and talking about the fact that we need to have a much more inclusive environment, and not just for women, but on every level. They invited us in to have a conversation, and I'm going to call out a couple of people, a couple of venture capital communities here, Blackbird Ventures and Airtree Ventures, because they invited me in to do closed door sessions for their entire team of unconscious bias workshops. And I'm not an expert on that, but you don't have to be. You just have to be willing to have engaged in the conversation. And the second thing is we just need to know, if we're all biased, what does the data say about the kind of organization that we are? What do we have? What don't we have? And what do we want to do about it? Because you can't make change if you're not willing to measure where you're at, and you're not willing to sort of set some stakes in the grounds of the direction that you want to go. Other than that, it's just nice and wishful thinking. So I think boards need to do that. Organizations need to do that. But if boards aren't willing to do it for themselves, they're not going to put that pressure on an organization, and it needs to be led from the top and not just a bottoms up activity. And then I think the third thing is to ask is, how do we address that? Like, what do we do if we're going to make a commitment to inclusion because it's good for business? And there is that much research out there that shows that diversity is good for the bottom line, right? It's not just gender diversity. Diversity in its fullest spectrum is good for product development. You make more inclusive products, which means you sell more and you have more revenue. It's great. It's good for everyone. Everybody can win if we do this right. But what are we going to do about it? And there's lots of things that you can do to sort of go down that pathway to build organizations that are inclusive and like that. But the number one thing, and I think Heather was touching on this about what's happened in her organization and on her board, is you have to have psychological safety, because you can have the most diverse set of people around a boardroom table, but if they don't have the freedom to put up their hand and to push back on something, or to ask a difficult or contentious or challenging question, if you're silencing those voices, then you no longer have diversity around that boardroom table. You actually just have a statistic. And I think psychological safety and how we think about that and how we make it safe for people to raise things and bring the fullness of their cultural understanding and their perspective, particularly if we're thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, we have to make it an environment where that is welcome. And it's welcomed not as a token thing, but it's welcomed because we actually truly value it and recognize that we are weaker and smaller without it. So we have to be really intentional about this as well.
Oh, thank you. So once we're intentional and we understand our biases and we welcome governance and we welcome challenge and we have a level of psychological safety, we bring in people like Matt, who comes to us with an understanding of obviously statistics, how one challenges assumptions, and in some ways starts to move the direction in a quite a mathematical way of the way we think about risk and the way we think about governance. So Matt, without wanting to speak for you, how do you respond to the sort of challenge that Sally has laid out for us, and so has Heather, given the roles that they play in their respective organisations.
Look, I agree with all the points made. I think where Sally was leading is that diversity in and of itself is not enough. It needs to be inclusive. So we often talk about diversity and inclusion. I don't think you have to look any further than modern portfolio theory, which proved a long time ago that you get a greater overall return with reduced risk by variance in your portfolio of investments. It's the same as variance in your investment in people, with not just the obvious diversity markers of different cultural background or gender, but actually genuine different ways of thinking and ensuring that those networks are connected. But I'm actually more interested in the bias which emerges subconsciously through the algorithms, which we as boards implicitly authorise our organisations to use, whether it's in marketing or through to employment and automatic CV detection. And this is where no doubt you can have bias, especially where you're trained on biased data in the first place, or where there wasn't enough diversity setting the business rules which were going to create these algorithms. But there's actually the great potential for this technology, on the other hand, to be turned against itself and to ensure that we use technology to test for bias. We use synthetic populations to understand where our data isn't representative fairly of the population where we want to apply these models. I think it's what's incumbent on boards is not to understand the detailed statistical tests that can be done for bias and fairness and appropriateness and model drift and missing populations, but at least to know that the onus is on them to consider that someone is applying those statistics and someone is monitoring these algorithms for bias. With great power comes great responsibility. And just because we now can do all of these amazing things with data and algorithms, what's incumbent on the board is to decide, how do we determine if we should do them? And that shouldn't be any one person's decision, because that's where we get the bias of the person who made that decision. What we should rather have is an instituted ethical framework that guides all levels of the organisation into making decisions about how they use data and analytics. An unbiased and fair framework for the ethics and the governance of these technologies. And that's entirely possible, as well as stipulating that they are continually monitored for bias and drift.
So, Matt, if I can just extend that by analogy. So once you successfully implement a really accountable form of AI and you have a fantastically diverse board, are you then ready to move to the next stage and replace them with robots or chatbots because everything is now a perfect storm? What can you do?
Look, I often think about AI and the application of AI across two dimensions. One of them is, how narrow is it? How much are we asking it just to do one thing versus how general is it? How much are we asking it to do many things? An example is a credit risk rating algorithm versus a self-driving car. The other important dimension is, are we taking humans out of the loop, or are we leaving them in the loop? Again, that's a spectrum, right? Taking humans completely out is different to having humans monitoring, is different to have humans pressing the button on every single take. The risk profiles of all quadrants that are exposed from narrow to general, from humans in the loop to humans out of the loop, are completely different. And the board really needs to be very accountable with a fallback plan of, what do you do if you take humans out of the loop? And of course, you put something in to detect the AI going rogue or drifting or behaving unsensibly. What do you do after you've removed those people and you've replaced all of your call center operators with chatbots, and suddenly you can't service your customers because your chatbot's gone completely rogue? Again, that different profile of risk, fantastic benefit in using chatbots. AI at first experience, always on, continual conversation, never waiting in a line, speaks whatever language I want it to speak. But on the other side of the coin, what are you going to do to detect that the answers are fair, reasonable, and robust?
Olga,
Yes.
sorry, I've just got to jump in on that, because I think that the question though is not whether or not a robot can replace a human. We're talking about future boards. Remember, the role of boards is governance. Governance is different to management. So you can automate management. We talked, Sally Ann's point about, we were talking about the role of bias, that 99.9% of what we, 99.99, I think you said, % of our decisions are based upon previous information. And that's what AI can do reasonably well. but it's the 0.01% that is where the phenomenal value comes, because humans can do something that AI can't do, and that's a cognitive leap. That is make a decision based upon intuition. There's a whole lot of science behind that, and that is where governance is particularly valuable. So, Sally, I look like you. Sally,
yeah, look, I'm just dying to jump in on this, where the AI and the humans still get it wrong together, right? And we've got this classic example where Apple, when they launched their credit card, I think it was a year or two ago, got absolutely done in by both the AI and the humans. So they released a credit card out there. Steve Wozniak got very upset, as did David Heinemeier Hansen, because both of their wives got lower credit scores or lower sort of amounts that they could have with this credit card than what they did, despite the fact that they have better credit scores and they jointly file tax returns and all of these things, right? So the data was wrong, and there was no human cognitive to actually ask the question in the design process or the board process, is this going to work? And so whenever somebody says the robots are coming to take my job or the AI is coming to take the role of the board, it's just not going to happen, right? This is Hollywood at its finest moment of telling you that we're at sentencing and, you know, the robots are going to come and they're going to make all these decisions. It's just not there. And the thing that we really need to understand, and why this matters so much, is that we have, you know, diversity around the boardroom table is not just who's around the boardroom table. It's actually the background and the understanding, the depth of understanding of the technology. Is like, you might have a really diverse board in all of those in some of the skills matrix, back to Heather's point. But if they're not somebody on there who deeply understands where technology could go wrong, or is used to having conversations about where it could go wrong, or where product development can go awry, we're going to actually end up in a place that's really messy. And there's the unintended consequence of the development of products is something that we're living out right now. You can bet your bottom dollar that nobody on the board and nobody around Facebook sat there and said, one day this platform that we're building to connect our friends, actually at the first time we were doing it to do all sorts of other things on campus around women, and let's not go back into that history, but you know, we're building this social connection platform, but actually it's going to be misused to spread fake news and to influence and, you know, impact on political, you know, outcomes. There's definitely that conversation's never happened. So we have to have people that have a deep understanding of technology, but have enough vision and enough futurist mindset to ask the crazy what if questions, because I can guarantee you, when you're sitting around the table and you're building a product and somebody asks that what if question of 10 years, everyone goes, oh no, that'll never happen. I'm like, yeah, it actually will. It will. We've had a pandemic before, you know, but yet we've got no pandemic plan off the shelf from Harvard Business School to be able to sort of say as leaders, well, this is how I manage through a pandemic. You know, that's being written right now, but we should have that. So we've got to think about this. There's just no way that AI is ever going to replace that human capability and that ability to question. My biggest challenge, though, is, do boards value this, and are they welcoming it, or are they token welcoming it to have a woman come on the board, to have an Indigenous or First Nations person somewhere in the world join their board? Or are they really seeking it to challenge them at the deepest level, at the core of who they are, to actually get great governance? Because when you do that and you wrestle with the really hard stuff, that's when you're going to get better governance and better outcomes for the long term for the company.
So let's unpack that. Let's unpack that. And this is really a question focusing on both Heather and your role as CEOs. What role do CEOs play, understanding the operational rhythm of the organization, but also having a close relationship with the board, and in essence, you know, being selected by the board in many respects? What is that? What does that synergy look like? What do you see as your respective roles as CEOs in your organization to support those very complicated, you know, arguments, let alone decisions? Maybe we start with Heather.
So I think there's a couple of things, and just to pick up what's already been said, all of this is about trust. Our organizations only exist because of trust that our supporters, our stakeholders, etc., have in us. So we actually need to then make sure that we build in transparency, etc., so that then our boards can ask those hard questions to then be able to maintain that level of trust. And there's no way that you know, a robot can work through the complexities of that, given the breadth of stakeholders that we have. So for me, with how I act as a CEO with a board is, I want that openness and transparency. I think gone are the days where a CEO just says the good news to a board, because I know when I've been a chair of a board, a government board, and my radar detector goes through overdrive when I just get positive news. So I think what is really important is that a CEO is open and transparent with the challenges, focuses more about, insights in the future, about what we're going to do and things. Often, and I've got my own board meeting this week, so I've been reflecting on my board papers going, oh, there's too much about what we've done. Lots of lovely activity, but not enough about focusing on the future and the challenges ahead and how we need to adapt when we're managing a landscape that we manage forever. So we're about protecting land forever. So we're on the long scale there, but we actually also need to look at short-term challenges, whether that be, COVID and, climate change, if it's somewhere in between in the time frame. So I think it's having that transparency and being prepared to be really challenged and seeing the board's role in that, rather than what may have been the case, 10, 15 years ago, where, there sort of was, in some cases, this thinking of the board's a necessary evil that you have to put up with. I think those days are well and truly gone. It's actually about embracing the fact that my role is to manage the organisation, but I need to be tested. I need to be challenged. I'll be down in the detail. I need those coming in from the side, from that diverse background, saying, well, what about this? What about that? What bias have you built into stuff? You're saying you've got that, insight from your data, but if your data's all rubbish going in, then that's not an insight at all. So you need that challenge.
It's interesting you say that COVID is a short-term challenge. Yes, we of course all hope that anything like a pandemic has a shortest possible lifespan, but many of commentators have said that it's actually accelerated certain trends that were already afoot, and particularly when it comes to the future of work. So I do want to get back to Sally's response to how you manage boards, but I think you mentioned a really important kind of point in time that also propels us to the future, probably faster than we were planning or anticipated. But it's actually quite an interesting time, both in terms of that human factor, but also the technological factor. So Sally, do you want to elaborate on the CEO role in leading the board and vice versa?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really great question. And I actually think it depends. I wish we could say we've transitioned on. I'm actually not that hopeful because I've sat on quite a few boards over my time, and I'm in an ED on a couple now as well. And I don't always see that trust and transparency and that pushing from both directions. I think there's a lot of legacy companies in Australia where that doesn't exist, and the board is still getting largely the good news story and really isn't under the hood and taking that leapfrog moment. I'd say that the good news is for emerging technology and emerging companies. I think one of the strengths of an early stage company is your board is often made up of some of your early stage investors. And if you've got your investment structure right, and I say if you've got, vision and values alignment, and they're there with you for the long haul to build that company, you have a values alignment about what you're trying to do to build that company. And so the risk appetite, how you're thinking about things will be aligned. And just by its very nature, when things are early, especially in deep tech, they take such a long time to kind of bring things to market. You do wrestle with really difficult questions all of the time. It's just a normal part of the day-to-day business operations. So it's really comfortable to have that conversation in the boardroom. And I think you certainly see that. And you see that in companies like ours, because we're trying to lead, the 40 companies under our roof, plus a massive portfolio, plus everybody else in the ecosystem. So my board, the conversations we have are quite different to some of the other boards that I sit on of companies that are much further along, really well established, probably have a few people around the board table that are a little bit more of a different generation, experience and background to me. So we've got some good diversity, but that transformational conversation and that pace of change is there's still a cultural disconnect, I would say, around the table there. And I think that's the other challenge that we have for boards and companies and organizations to deal with in this, is it's not just about governance, it's about the pace of change. And how do you manage that transformation, not just during COVID, but the fact that actually society is, you know, we are on a curve up, and technology, we've been on that for a very, very long time. But I don't think the way some of our larger boards, and probably more of our listed boards in Australia, at least, if I think about Australian context, have necessarily kept that sort of pace of change. And so you're always playing a little bit of catch up because you haven't got that right lever to take the leap and move the board from a catch up and a governance and steering the ship on course and making sure we don't go into an iceberg to actually, my gosh, we need to actually build two levers to go up and over the iceberg, because there's going to be a whole lot of icebergs, you know, coming at us. So it's a really interesting one, having a foot in both sorts of camps of boards right now.
Rob, do you think we're having the debate at the right level?
This is such a, no, we're not, because if you think about how we reward non-executive directors, we encourage them, don't rock the boat too much, because if you want to get a number of board seats in a portfolio and you get known as a troublesome director, you may not get invited to the next, onto the next seat. And it has never mattered more, because one of the big things that's changed through COVID is we are entering a period where there's lots of icebergs in the water. Most of the NEDs who are coming into the NED portfolios now have done their entire executive career through 30 years of unparalleled growth, not just in Australian history, but in world history. Australia has had a longer period without recession than any other country at any other time in a millennia of measured economic history. And then we're saying to them, you're coming into a period where instead of the underlying principle of being growth, so you can bury your mistakes in general background growth. You may not get as much growth as you should have got, but your mistake will be hidden, to a period where we'll have a portfolio that is made up of some things that will grow, some things that will shrink, and the thing that was shrinking will be growing in 6 months, and the thing that was growing will be shrinking in 6 months. And if you get that mix wrong, the risk multiplier is much, much larger than it was before. So the quiet Ned who doesn't rock the boat too much is the worst thing that a CEO could possibly have. A CEO and a management team will benefit from and will ultimately be grateful for a group of directors who will make them uncomfortable. And I think that's a debate we really need to have. Are we encouraging and really rewarding those directors who are going to make everybody feel a little bit dislocated and uncomfortable at a time we most desperately need it?
That's a very that's a very admirable challenge that you're throwing both to the executive and the boards. Can I bring the discussion a little bit back to data and one of the things that we were all very passionate about? So we have a crisis, we have diversity, and we have a moment in time where you are making decisions in some ways in a very limited data set, because you're drawing on a whole lot of unfinished stories. What does AI and what does big data have to offer, or would you suggest we steer of it? So this is really a question to all members of the panel, but perhaps we can start with Matt.
Sure. There's a universe of techniques in both AI and non-AI that actually don't require a bunch of historical data. Reinforcement learning simply requires the laws of the game. Simulating a situation, building a digital twin to ask powerful what-if questions that look at the interactive forces is a fantastic way to face into an uncertain future. A lot of the work we've been doing in COVID and post-COVID, given historical data is no good, actually turns to these techniques like advanced simulation or optimization of simulated content around perceived distributions to really look at the complex effects of basically the unknown. However, Olga, I think it's interesting that we have these conversations, but I actually think many of the boards that I've been exposed to, unfortunately, aren't even asking the first question of, well, have we used data and analytics in a sophisticated way to inform us on this decision we need to make? I mean, we're not yet led in a corporate sense in Australia or elsewhere by a generation of leaders that don't think otherwise than to turn to data and analytics as the first port of call. Bring me the evidence, and then let's apply our intuition and our knowledge. So yes, there are certainly techniques which can be used in COVID and uncertain future times. And COVID's actually had a fantastic silver lining in terms of accelerating the adoption of advanced technologies. However, I really think we need to challenge the boards to say, well, are you putting evidence and data and analytics inside everything you do, or at least attempting to by default?
Thank you. Heather?
Can I just add that we look at all data sets? So particularly now during, NAIDOC week, that it's not just, a set of, Western scientific, acquired data. And if I use, my area, that when we look at management of land for conservation, it's not these, types of data that we're actually using all data sets. So it's the stories, it's the song lines, it's that 65,000 years worth of knowledge. That is data in itself. Now we have to work very closely with traditional owners for their comfort about how that is utilised and how we do it together, but how we do far more of what I'd call as a right way science approach, where you actually take the time to sit down, get to know each other and learn from each other. Then your data becomes a lot richer. And then you can make better informed decisions rather than just having it very skewed for one way of looking at the world. So I think that's really important, but we are really just at the starting point of that across Australia and across the globe as far as how we work with First Nations people.
Thank you, Heather. Sally?
Look, I've been pondering this as I've been listening, and I agree with, I agree with Matt's points and Heather's points. I think one of the things that I see around the boardroom table quite a lot, and I actually see this in management as well, I think it's a fundamental problem that we have, and it's part of how our brain works, and we have to risk mitigate ourselves against it, is that we jump into solutions mode. And so we look at data and we make decisions based on data, and we're making a decision, and sometimes I'll sit there and go, why are we doing this? What's the why behind this? And it sounds really obvious and it sounds really simple, and people go, oh gosh, that never happens. I'm like, well, let me tell you, I'm pretty sure it happens around every boardroom table and meeting I've been in, either my boards or the boards I serve on and have served on, every single board meeting. Well, we get into this decision thing and we're looking at the data and we're interrogating it. And maybe we do have all the data. Maybe we have actually sat down and we've got all of that. But we actually don't know why we're making a decision on something. And so the why of some of these things really matters. And I think that's actually a fundamental challenge in how we get into board situations. And it's part of it is rhythm and culture. Like that's the other thing. Governance is one of those things that I'm increasingly banging on about these days. I keep talking about it, and it's so unsexy and it seems so boring, and I'm not a lawyer, but it really, really matters, because if you get your governance process and your framework wrong, you never set up enough time to ask the question why. And the question why, I think, is one of the most fundamental things that we can do, because it speaks to vision. And if we can't answer the why question, we actually probably don't have a clear vision that actually lines up to it, because why should always speak to the vision. It always should speak to an outcome. And then you can get into the data and looking at that and how does technology help you with that. But I would say the biggest challenge that I see on most boards right now is they've got their rhythm, they've got their corporate. I mean, how many people out there right now are sitting here and sending out their corporate calendar for next year for all of their board meetings, all of their committee meetings, the scope of work that you're going to do, all of those things. We've already programmed the entire year of boardroom conversations, and we're not allowing the space to ask why around purpose and why, and giving the space for these new things to come up. And I think that's a real problem, and I don't have a solution on how we wrestle with it, but I think it's one that we don't want to go down the path of just data making decisions and not coming back to that and sanity checking on that as much as we can and creating space for that, because that's when diversity and psychological safety and having people around the boardroom who aren't afraid to question everything, even the new shiny product you're about to launch, with that why question, that's the most valuable time that you can really have.
Can't we can actually join these? So I'm pointing at where you are, both Heather and Sally Ann on my screen. So, but we can actually join these two ideas together. If I nerd out for a second, and Matt will appreciate there's a technique of using data, Bayesian statistics, which is actually about building on the journey of the data. And I'm way oversimplifying here, but I have the privilege of working with some Indigenous advisors who've helped me enormously I am very much at the beginning of the journey. And I was introduced to the concept of the songline and to the journey. And it absolutely resonated for me. I anchored it back in that why and the data journey, because what Bayesian tells us about is it's not, we fall into the trap of using a data set and making a decision. And in boardrooms, we fall into the trap of management bringing in a really compelling graph with a really compelling set of data behind it at a point in time, and we say, right, that's obvious. We should be going after this group of donors, this group of members, this group of customers. Whereas actually what matters is how you got there over a period of time. And it turns out that, if you're looking at a sales pipeline, how that sales pipeline changed over a period of time actually is as important as is the final set of numbers that you have. When you're looking at a pandemic, which is vaguely relevant at the moment, and you're looking at the health of populations, is not just that the end point of what their health is today, it's what their journey was to that point of health. They'll give you a better chance of predicting where they're going to be in the future. So if in the calendar of setting up a governance framework, we're actually clever enough to force everybody to not just bring us the data of the evidence of the decision you're about to make, but bring us on the journey of how you're making those decisions and the data that you're using and how it's evolving. We'll all go on that journey. And one more thing we need to do is we need to be much more forgiving of each other, management and boards, of making mistakes. Because in Australia, we have a really bad habit of not wanting to make mistakes and not wanting to admit mistakes, because that's a really bad thing. And yet making mistakes is the most valuable thing we can do with data if we have the courage to talk about our mistakes and then learn from them and actually build those mistakes into our algorithms for what we're going to do in the future.
Some of our participants here have actually asked a series of really relevant questions in terms of, once you accept all of these propositions about diversity, about the challenges of basically change, whether it's gradual change or radical change, how do you go about setting a risk appetite for these kind of rare events that have exposed really a lot of organizations, boards and management to a decision-making process and technologies and even questions that they didn't have to answer before? How do you deal with setting a risk appetite where your risk is such a dynamic question? And how do you make it so that you can do so in a genuinely modern environment with modern technology and all of the tools that we have available to us, whether all the time or in extreme circumstances more of the time? What's your view, Rob?
I'm actually going to throw to the actuary in the in the room, but again, risk appetite is not about prediction of what's going to happen. Stuff is going to happen, and we all of our businesses are exist in a world of risk and getting a return on the risk. The job is to be able to package that up and to create the portfolio around it. It is, as we started this discussion, saying, insurers actually understood what the risk of a pandemic is, and that risk hasn't changed. We also know what the risk of a cyber war is. We know what the risk of trade wars are. We know what the risk of other technological events are. We know what the risk of a solar flare is. You just keep on aggregating these layers and layers of things that will happen. Don't get freaked out by them, but just say, once you take all of that as a superset of the environment, what segment affects the type of business that that we're in, and then within that, just simply decide how many levels of protection. I mean, unless we're all going to put tinfoils around our heads and dig ourselves deep in a cave and get 100 years worth of food supply, we are going to take risk, and some risks could be cataclysmic in what they have happened to us, and that is okay because we exist in the real world. We just simply should pick ourselves up, learn from the pandemic, and say, do I need to revisit my my risk frameworks and really make sure I am thinking about not just the risks that happen every 3, 5, 10 years, but what are the risks that do happen once every 100 years that we haven't had happen. We'll presumably all have pandemic plans, but have we got cyber war plans? Have we got solar flare plans where the electricity grids will be brought down? Have we got societal disruption plans in place, and what will we do? But by the way, I would hate to see that turn into an environment where then we just become so fearful that we put layers of protection around ourselves. That would be a huge mistake.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very mindful of time, and I wanted to spend a few minutes firstly saying thank you to all of our speakers, and Rob has helped me finish on a very positive note. And if I was to ask the question again as to who I'd like to be stuck with in an airport, it'd be very hard for me to choose between all the speakers today, because obviously I would hear a lot about song lines, I would hear a lot about data. I suspect there might be a little bit of shopping and predictive analytics involved, and all in all, it'd be a very cultural experience as well as highly intellectual. So on that note, I just want to give the floor back to ACC and Marina, who wants to say a couple of words, but really my sincere thank you to such a generous and really candid discussion with all of you. So thank you very much. So I'll hand you back to our managers.
That's very nice of you. Thank you so much, Olga, and what a wonderful panel. I thought in the time available, probably just a word on each speaker. Robert, I give you the word, two words, be challenged through openness. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because stuff will happen. To Matt, don't walk when with data you can run. I hope you don't mind, but very impressed with your dedication to fitness there. And of course, comments. Sally, question everything, don't forget to ask why. And Heather, your comment around a rich data set actually requires human connection. There were many takeaways for me this evening, a fantastic panel, very generous with your thoughts and comments, and of course sharing your expertise with us. And Olga, thank you so much for sharing. My phone is now beeping at me, so I'll have to stop that bit of technology, but then thank you again. Just quickly to announce our final event for this year for the Australian Society for Computers and the Law. Kelly, can I please ask you to put the next screen on? Thank you. Great. I'm not sure how closely you follow the Eurovision contest, but it was cancelled this year because of COVID, but they did manage to run the AI song contest. And I know this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but Australia won that competition with Uncanny Valley. We're delighted to say they'll be joining us for our end of year function, which is on the 26th of November. And Kelly, could you please go to the next screen? Thank you so much. Oh, nice transition. And there are at least 4 of our speakers. We hope to have to confirm another 2 speakers for the evening. But please join us if you're interested in receiving an invitation and you're not yet on our distribution list. You have the address there at the bottom of the screen. We look forward to joining you and you joining us on the 26th. And again, a very big and warm thank you to our incredible panel and Olga for moderating. Thanks again. See you soon. Bye. Thank you, panelists.